Hi, I'm Chloe.
And I'm Bez.
And this podcast is for graduate teachers in their first 5 years.
We share our own teaching stories as well as advice and ideas we wish we'd had as graduate teachers.
Sometimes funny, sometimes horrifying, but always true.
We want you to thrive and love teaching beyond the dreaded 5-year cliff.
Hi, I'm Chloe, and my annoying teacher habit is that I constantly twirl my hair.
Hi, I'm Bez, maths and science teacher, and my annoying teacher habit is I start the sentence with okay a lot.
I think I do that as well. Okay.
Yeah.
You probably hear us do it in this podcast.
Yeah, now I'm like thinking back.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah.
Kids are like, okay.
Okay.
Okay, what?
So welcome back to another new episode
Of Two Friends Who Teach.
Yes. And today we're going to be talking about differentiation. What is it? Why is it important? What's the difference between differentiation and NCCD?
And what does that even stand for?
So many acronyms in the teaching world. So have you got a story or an experience of differentiation?
So many. Why don't we start with what it actually is differentiation? So before we jump in, how do we define that, Bez?
Okay, so differentiation is pretty much where a teacher will make adjustments to either the content or the process or the product that's expected from a student. And that can either be in the process of their learning, it can also be with their assessments as well. It's pretty much in everything, the whole teaching and learning, making adjustments to support the students and what they need.
So it's essentially just putting those adjustments in place so that every learner can grow and succeed in their learning.
Yes, very important.
Awesome. So in the context of differentiation, I mean, this is something that you've probably come across a lot, but I know that in the very early days of my teaching, I often thought that differentiation meant that I needed to be creating completely different tasks or giving somebody a completely different set of work or those kinds of things. And in some cases that might be true, but certainly not in all cases. And I remember we had a differentiation specialist at our school who just sort of started the role in one of my earlier teaching jobs. And she was fantastic. And I used to always go to her with different ideas and I'd throw different ideas at her and bounce things off of her. I think part of what I did was both useful, but some of what I did was probably a little bit unnecessary.
As in you did too much or?
Yeah, I think so. I went through a bit of a phase in my maths classes where I was very into differentiated worksheets. And I was creating all these different worksheets for different students, from class to class.
It's a big time investment.
Yeah, it was a big time investment. And it was somewhat successful. But I also think sometimes I probably differentiated things a little bit too much. And I probably needed to challenge some of my students a little bit more than I was.
Yeah.
Which was a good lesson for me because I think at that time, finding a student's zone of proximal development, it's a difficult thing to do. And I was still very new to my career and I didn't have a lot of resources and tools to draw from. And so I was able to generate lots of these different worksheets. Sometimes I'd let students choose which worksheet they wanted to complete.
Sort of a learning menu.
Yeah, I literally had a different activity that's called a learning menu that had entrees, mains and desserts, and it was a choose your own adventure type thing. We'll get there later. But I think that was the biggest thing. I did have some learners who I think were really used to getting these worksheets and having this differentiated work that they probably weren't extending themselves enough. And I think I needed to set some higher expectations at times.
Yeah.
And also, like you said, that was a really big time sink for me. That was something that I was constantly creating throughout the year and spending hours and hours doing and poring over, and it was a lot of printing, and like printing budget was a bit tight, and then I'd be left with all of these handouts and then getting students to put things in their books, and it was just probably I do things pretty differently now.
Yeah. And it's always when you're starting your teaching career, right, it's because you haven't got the years or the resources on you, it's sort of part of, you sort of have to go through that. And then once you gain that experience and then you've got your resources, differentiation becomes much more easier because in the back of your head you've got, at least a dozen different activities that you've tried and tested with different students and different classes.
You got a toolkit to draw from.
Yeah. And I experienced the same thing as well, But
I think, I think, this is definitely going to happen to you early in your career, but it could happen to you later in your career as well. Like, if it's a new experience, like you might be met with a bit of a challenge, and that's okay.
Yeah.
I think the important thing is when it comes to differentiation, it's really important that you're trying.
Yeah.
But I think one thing that I needed to be really mindful of is making sure that differentiation didn't mean different curriculum.
Yes, that's very important to highlight.
Yeah, and there is a time and place where students may need different curriculum, but there is a very specific set of circumstances under which we can provide that.
Yeah.
What's your experience before we dive into some of those other juicy topics?
Mine is pretty much exactly as you described. Like, early in my teaching career, I definitely did a lot more differentiation, but supporting more like the students who need extra support rather than the students who needed to be extended. There was actually one parent-teacher interview where the parent was like, my daughter's not being extended. And that was fair, and to be honest.
You were like, you're probably right.
And it had fallen wayside because I was, the students who needed extra support, that attention just naturally is drawn there. And then because the students who need the extension, they're very self-sufficient.
Yeah, they can be independent.
Yeah, so they don't really draw your attention in. So that was a really big learning experience for me. But I was like the same as you. I didn't really do a lot of different worksheets, but a lot of time was put in like changing an activity and trying to create like 3 different alternative tasks, which is very time consuming. And then even like initially on, like I really struggled to differentiate and what that actually looked like. So I really relied on other teachers in the team to sort of show me what that could look like. Like I knew it was content and process and all those things, but what did that actually look like,
Yeah.
I think early on, quite frankly, I struggled with it.
Totally understand that.
Yeah.
And I think I did a little bit too. I think I probably thought I was doing a really fantastic job. And then upon reflection, I was like, oh, okay, I'd probably change some of this.
Yeah.
But you get better at it.
Yeah.
And the more you understand, like you said, you spoke about content and process and those types of things, the more you understand the different types of differentiation, what it is, how to do it, how to differentiate for students at different levels, it becomes easier.
Yeah.
So why don't we discuss then, like, what are some, different ways or some different examples of how to differentiate tasks under some of those, like, different categories.
Sounds great.
For example, why don't we discuss, like, differentiation under process, for example? Why don't we think of, like, I don't know, I'll give you a scenario. There's, like, okay, there's a student in the class who is an EAL learner. They are doing a practical task and you've given them like a long-worded method. How could we adjust the process of the prac for this to ensure that this student can succeed?
Well, in that case, you'd be wanting to simplify that method. So cutting the amount of words, even like the language that's used to ensure that it's accessible for that particular student. You could even include images as well in order to support them. So, it's not just words, but they've also got a visual aid there with them as well. What other things do you reckon you would have done?
You could model it before you actually teach it. So model like the steps so that they have that visual, or you might even give students like a a video recording of the method being done prior to, or something they can refer back to.
Yeah.
And I know I've worked with many EAL learners. Something that can often help them is to sort of pre-load them with some of the content.
Yeah.
So you might give them the class before and be like, hi, not hi. Hi. Hey, we're going to do this prac next class. I'm going to give you the method now so that you can go over it. Please come to me with some questions that you have next class.
Yeah.
And then we'll go through it again.
Yeah. That preloading's so helpful, isn't it?
Yes.
Students.
Yeah. But obviously, adjustments to language glossaries and those types of things might work as well.
Yeah.
You haven't changed the task.
Exactly.
The task is exactly the same. The content is still the same. We've just sort of changed the method in which they engage with it.
Yes.
So the process in which they engage with it.
Yeah.
So that's like a really simple example. And that's in a science classroom. But you could do similar things in other classrooms. Scaffolds is where my brain goes when it comes to adjusting for process.
Yeah, absolutely. And the whole thing that you said about like videos as well, if it's a class that you know you're going to teach again, possibly,
Yep.
students who are comfortable filming that process or explaining what that process is, you could even ask them to do that. So then you've got that short clip that you can reuse or share with other students as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, that doesn't just have to be for a prac.
Yeah.
That could be for something else. It could be for like a written piece, like a think aloud, or like a student or yourself modelling a written response or, whatever it is.
Yeah.
There's a range of different things that you could still film.
Yeah.
Content, I feel like, is the easy one. So
Yes.
we'll go there next. Differentiating for content.
Have you got an example? I think that might be helpful if you could provide an example of a case when you've differentiated the content in your class.
Yeah, I think I just want to sort of flag first that there's sort of two different ways you might differentiate content. One might be that you're just differentiating content in terms of like the type of example or stimulus or something that you've used, but you just switch to another one that's still part of the curriculum.
Yeah.
The other example is when you may need to differentiate content because the student that you're working with, it has different curriculum needs. In order to do that, you do need parental permission.
Yeah.
So don't just do that just
yeah.
because.
That's very important.
Extension's a little bit of a different story as long as they've already learnt the current curriculum. But, you don't want to be like differentiating down when you don't have parental permission. That's pretty important.
And then the flow-on effect of that is not great because
No.
then you're reporting it and then it's a surprise to the parents.
Yes.
So, yes, very important.
So I'll just sort of highlight that. But absolutely. I actually used to teach an accelerated class for science. And so I was teaching a class of pretty gifted learners. And so we did teach the curriculum at the time, but then like where necessary, we would extend students. And that was like a massive focus for us. So I had some year 7 students. They were lovely to work with. They were very engaged, very excited. Sometimes they're a little bit too keen, and I was like, no, we need to work on this skill at the moment. But particularly when it came to like scientific skills, I would there were times where we were learning up to sort of like year 9. And so like in our curriculum at the time, they needed to learn about, basics of an experimental method, variables, extraneous variables. But we could go into a little bit more of the detail and I could teach them about like accuracy and precision and those types of things.
Yeah.
And then we could talk about like different types of errors and learning how to identify those. And so that was really fun. And then I think I remember in year 7, they were learning about forces. And I know like Newton's laws generally comes in like year 9 usually according to the curriculum here. But I was like, hey, these guys are totally ready for it. Like we're going to start to learn Newton's laws and we're going to start doing some more calculations.
Yeah.
And they ate it up. So it was really great for them. They were really ready for it. But yeah, I've also had instances in a maths classroom where I've had students in year 7 or year 8 who have been ready for curriculum at much higher levels. I once taught a year 8 student that was learning log functions.
Wow.
Which challenged me.
Yes.
And I've had, year 7 students who I've been teaching Pythagoras theorem. So, yeah, the extension side of things has been a pretty interesting journey for me. But I have had students on the flip side where I have had permission, I've had to sort of focus on the skills of where they're at. I've found that in maths classes, like that range is very wide.
Yes.
So, I've taught some students who have difficulty, adding 2-digit numbers together. And we've had to work on some of their basic number skills. Fractions is always one that came up.
Oh, yeah. That's always
It's always a sticky
interesting
topic
one.
for students for some reason. Just things like that. So just making sure that, I could develop those skills. And look, there were times, I think, in a maths classroom where, you kind of do need those pre-existing skills in order to progress. So it might be that, okay, I teach that along with
something else. Yeah.
the other things that we need to do as part of our differentiated work.
Love that.
What about
Very
you?
great. I think you summed it up. I don't really. Mine would probably be the same as you.
Yeah. Have you taught any streamed classes, or have your classes been more mixed?
Mine have certainly been mixed at my first school. Actually, we had, it was an experience, but was great for my personal development. But at my first school, in the second year, we actually went from I always get confused with horizontal and vertical. We went from a vertical curriculum, so rather than year 7, year 8, year 9, year 10 classes, all of our classes it became a horizontal curriculum. So essentially we had was pitched as a year 9 science class, but you could have year 8 students in there. You could also have year 10 students completing
that's
that.
a massive change.
Yeah, and so year on year and semester on semester, the cohort that you had in what was a year 9, supposedly a year 9 class, would have such a big range of different abilities.
Was there a selection process out of curiosity? In terms of how they...
There was definitely a selection process. So you couldn't just be like, I want to do that subject.
Yep.
It was a lot of one-on-one sitting down, having a look at the students' reports and their learning dispositions and if they're ready.
So they tried to get students in there that would be at roughly similar levels of their learning, but you still had a big variety.
Yeah.
Okay.
So in that case, if we're talking about content being differentiated, pretty much exactly the same as you, it just depended on the group of students. If they needed to be extended further than year 9, then I would do that. But there's also, for example, I'm just sort of thinking of maths. In terms of differentiating the content and, moving them up or below a year level, you've also got the ability to differentiate horizontally. So moving them along, I guess, like Bloom's taxonomy, where if they've really understood the content, one way to further differentiate that is sort of move them to the evaluating and the problem solving.
I'm so glad you mentioned Bloom's because my brain has been there.
Yeah. And it's such an important part of differentiation, isn't it?
Yeah. Thinking about the taxonomies that you're using.
Yeah, but you can differentiate vertically, so along year levels. You can also, differentiate horizontally as well. So moving along like Bloom's taxonomy. And that way, they're still on that curriculum, but they're just developing that skill
absolutely.
more deeply. Yeah.
I love that. Another way that you can also differentiate is just, I feel like this one's probably a little bit more for engagement, but it can be the context of the different examples that you're using. I once had a very disengaged learner in my year 9 maths class who was, going through some school refusal and really, really disliked maths. That's, something that we see with a lot of students, and changing their minds can be really difficult. But I knew that this student loved rugby, loved it, ate up rugby. Me, I know nothing about rugby. So I tried to learn
Oh, wow.
different like rugby plays. And we were doing Pythag and Trig at the time. And so I tried to make questions up that involved different rugby plays
Oh, I
in
love
triangles.
that. Yeah, I love that.
And yeah, I think that really helped to sort of engage him a little bit because it was something that he thought was interesting. And then he'd always tell me if one of my plays was terrible. And I was like, yeah, but I had to make it a triangle.
Yeah, and I tried.
And I'm trying here. So yeah, that was another thing that you can do. The last one that we've got here is the product. Let's talk about what that means. Like if we're differentiating by product, it's usually your final result, right?
Yeah, some sort of
Assignment or assessment or task.
Yes.
But it's more about the how it's presented. So examples, Bez.
Examples is we do a lot of written
We do.
assessments, and I think it's a very common, comfortable one to do. But, if we're differentiating the product, we could change requiring a student to write out, for example, their scientific report.
Yep.
What they could actually do is a poster instead as well. In terms of, I'm just thinking of like written responses, so short answer sections, or, even in humanities where they're expected to write paragraphs responding to a question. One way that you can differentiate that is using sentence starters or prompts so that they've got those guiding pieces to help them as well.
I'm also thinking, you gave the example of like a student doing a practical report or the process or the method of a prac or something like that. And I mean, this doesn't just go for science, it goes for any subject. But like you said, we rely very heavily on written types of responses. It doesn't mean that students can't present and demonstrate their learning in other ways.
Absolutely.
So I remember in uni, we used to always say like, students can demonstrate their learning by anything that they do, say, make or write. And we lean on the right.
Yes, we do.
But a student can still do something or make something or say something that can demonstrate to us that they've learnt something.
Yeah.
So they might video themselves doing a method, or they might do an acted out piece or an oral presentation, or they might draw a process. Obviously, we need to make sure that they're still able to do the things as part of the curriculum. But those adjustments, I think, like they're adjustments that might be necessary that can be made. I know that with a lot of students that I've taught that suffer from anxiety, giving an oral presentation was absolutely terrifying to them. Yeah. So whether or not you change that oral presentation to something else, maybe they video themselves and that, doesn't get shown to the class.
Yeah.
Or whether, it's a voice recording or, I don't know, just something different.
Yeah. And it can even, as you say, just be like, they just really have to demonstrate their understanding of that, and that doesn't have to be written.
And I think we need to often ask ourselves, if we're asking students to produce work in a particular way as a particular product, is there a purpose for us requesting it in that form? If there is, and it's part of a specific skill that's being assessed, like oral presentation skills or whatever it is, okay, then maybe we want to look at alternatives sort of within that field, like a voice recording or something. But if what we're assessing is not in fact related to that at all, and oral presentation skills are not being assessed, then perhaps doing something written or a storyboard or whatever it is an acceptable alternative.
Yeah.
All right, we've discussed a lot about like these different types of adjustments. We've kind of touched on the fact that, okay, there are times where we need to be really careful about the adjustments that we're making, particularly if we need to give adjustments that are at different curriculum levels. Let's talk about the why.
Yes, let's.
So often we will be working with students with disabilities, and we need to make sure that we are providing inclusive learning for all our learners. And you may have heard this acronym, or you will hear this acronym called NCCD.
Yes.
Do you have any idea what that stands for, Bez?
nationally consistent collection of data. Yeah, and it's pretty much on the school students with disability.
Ooh, it's almost like you memorized that for this. Yeah. So that's why we don't say it in full.
Yes.
But NCCD, it's essentially the reporting that we must do on any student that has a disability. And disability has a pretty broad definition. So it could be a physical disability, it could be a psychological disability, a cognitive disability, social, the list goes on.
Yeah.
But it is in this context when we're talking about learning, any disability that can impact a learner's ability to learn, I suppose. Yeah, for lack of more words that are coming to my brain right now. At times, you will have students that have a diagnosed disability. And you will know about this because they will have an individual learning plan, or they might be called something different at your school, but they will have a learning plan of sorts that's put together that outlines the requirements and the adjustments that we need to be making for them in order to access their learning. Fun fact, part of my role in some of my previous work was that I used to work with students, families, and external providers and the school to put these learning plans together.
This is right up your alley then.
This is right up my alley. So I was responsible for like all of Year 10 students who fell under the NCCD.
Yeah.
So yeah, there were a bunch of students and you will have many students who you work with that will have disabilities and who will have learning plans. You may have students who have disabilities, but maybe their family has not disclosed this to the school, and so maybe they don't have a learning plan yet.
Yes.
If you find out that that is the case, it's really important that you contact the right person at your school, and if you're not sure who that is, I highly recommend going to like a learning leader or a deputy principal just to highlight that, because it means that we should be putting a learning plan in place for them, and that you'd have to go through the process of contacting parents, etc. On the flip side of this, you may also have students who you deem to potentially have what we call an imputed disability. Have you heard of that before, Bez, or have you come across any students that have imputed disabilities?
I haven't heard of the specific term imputed disability, so what is that, Chloe?
Yeah, so an imputed disability is an undiagnosed disability that the school team considers a student to have and that has a functional impact on their learning.
I have had students of that.
Yeah, you probably most definitely would have. But it might be that, you have an idea that perhaps a student has, perhaps they're neurodiverse and there are certain things that trouble them or that they find challenging that impact their ability to engage in different parts of their learning, which just means that they require adjustments. And I think part of this is just making sure that teachers have the awareness in order to make the appropriate adjustments for these students.
Yeah. Quick question.
Yeah.
When teachers are making these adjustments, should they be recorded somewhere?
Absolutely.
Or is it just make an adjustment as you go along?
Yeah. So through part of the NCCD is that we do need to keep track of the adjustments that are being made.
Very, very important.
This does also link into the funding that a student will get, and there are sort of different levels under the NCCD that students will get classified in to do with their level of disability.
Yeah.
So it's really important that you're making sure that throughout the year you're aware of what adjustments you've been making. Your school will probably have a system in which you track these. So it could be that you record them through your school's LMS system, or there's a specific record that you need to keep track of. Or I know some schools have like a list of adjustments and then you tick off the adjustments that you've been making throughout the year.
Oh, that's a handy one. I wish I had that one.
In order for a student to qualify under the NCCD, you need to be making adjustments for, I think it's like 10 weeks of the year.
Yeah.
And so that needs to be looked at in secondary school, like across all classes.
Yeah.
And just because a student receives an adjustment in one class doesn't mean that they may need that adjustment in another.
Yeah.
Particularly for things like physical disabilities, a student may need significant adjustments in a phys ed class or a food class or even a science class or an art class for pracs, but that might look a little bit different in an English class, for example.
Yeah, for sure. So going back to I can just circle back, you've had a lot of experience with learning plans and, you mentioned with the year 10 students. Can you provide some tips on how to read these learning plans and how to make the relevant adjustments from what you've read on these?
Yeah, absolutely. So generally up the top, there will be a section that has what the student's diagnosis is, or if it's an imputed disability, what the perceived disability or struggle for that student might be, challenge. And then a bit of a profile on the student to do with, I think we should be leaning towards a strengths-based approach with these things. So making sure that we know, what are the strengths of this student? What are some of the things that they do find challenging? And then what are our strategies that we can put in place to support that? So it might be that, for example, a student has a language processing disorder and they struggle with lots of verbal information. So a strategy that might be useful for them might be to give information in small chunks, to provide them with dot points or numbered steps on what they need to do throughout a class in a written format, and that they might need frequent check-ins. And in order to make sure that they've understood something, you get them to repeat things back to you. So they're just some adjustments that are an example. Again, they're going to look really different for different students. But yeah, I think part of this is all of the differentiation that we've spoken about fits into this.
Yes.
So as part of NCCD, it encompasses all of the differentiation that we've spoken about. It just means that we need to be giving specific types of differentiation for certain students. And you may then have the permission to differentiate at a different year level of curriculum.
Yes.
Imputed disabilities tell us that, yes, we can still differentiate, but it might not be at the same curriculum level. But I don't know, I think it's important to note that whether a student is on that NCCD list or not, we should still consider
absolutely
whether we should be differentiating or not. That's just part of your quality differentiated practice.
Yes.
And that can be provided to all students. But where the NCCD comes in is where you're providing more consistent or higher levels of adjustments for students beyond your quality differentiated practice.
Yes. We should include the tier. Remember that differentiation tier?
Yeah. There is
the
differentiation diamond. We might redirect you to the NCCD website, which have incredible resources and lots of online modules that you can access as part of upskilling.
So that's one way that I guess you can support yourself if you need some more assistance with differentiation and NCCD.
Yep.
Is there any, I'm just thinking back to when we were, beginner teachers.
Yeah.
Where can or who can you seek support from?
Yep.
With this whole differentiation and NCCD thing.
Yeah, I think for general information on NCCD, definitely check out the NCCD website. Check out their online modules. They also run PD.
Yeah.
They're fantastic. And they've got lots of case studies and things, so you can sort of learn to apply your skills.
Oh, love that.
But otherwise, if you are concerned about a particular student that you know has a disability and you don't know how to make the appropriate adjustments for them, speak to their other teachers. Maybe even speak to someone like their homeroom teacher. Speak to their coordinators, year level coordinators, or whoever heads up sort of the NCCD at your school.
Yeah.
Also, speak to the student and their families. Parents will tell you what works and what doesn't.
Yes.
They know their students.
Yes.
And they will see that you're really making an effort and they will absolutely appreciate that.
Yeah, you're right. It's part of the teaching standard where, you're building those connections and relationships with the community, which includes parents and caregivers as well. And that includes it for differentiation as well.
Yep.
Yep.
And they're going to be really interested in, if there's something that you found that that works that's new that you hadn't tried before, like they'll want to know about it. They want to be part of that partnership.
Absolutely. And it's important that they are.
Yep.
Yeah.
So I've just thought of something now. So there are, you may have access to a school speech therapist, or you may even have school counsellors or psychologists.
Yep.
They can also be fabulous to work with. Obviously, there'll be like certain information that they can't share with you because of confidentiality. But I've often worked with school psychologists and speech therapists in my role, and I know that they've been really happy to work with other teachers on different strategies to support students, depending on what it is that they need.
Yeah. So if there was one takeaway that you wanted to give for beginner teachers on differentiation and NCCD, what's that one thing?
I would say that it's important that we understand that differentiation can be for everyone, but NCCD is not for everyone.
That's excellent. I love that.
Yeah, and it's, just making sure that you understand that distinction. Yeah.
Because they have significant impacts as well.
Yeah, they do. How about you?
Mine would be, I'm just thinking back to when I first started teaching, differentiation doesn't have to be recreating one task into 5 separate tasks. You know, they can be minor, very different changes, but you don't have to recreate that one task into 5 separate tasks.
You can use blooms, or you can just change how they're presenting it.
Exactly.
Change the example.
Or the amount of content as well. So, it doesn't have to be recreated, essentially.
Yeah, you don't need to recreate to make something accessible.
Yes, exactly. Awesome. So on that note, if you enjoyed this episode and enjoy our podcast, please like and subscribe or follow. I've gone into YouTube language. Sorry, got my wires mixed. If there's anything that you'd like us to talk about in the future, please let us know in the comments.
Help us differentiate our content for you.
Love that. We'll catch you next time.
Bye.
Bye.